Whew, okay, we'll cut that, Charlie. What is this movie called? Hey guys, so a few weeks ago, I think about 2 weeks ago, maybe a week and a half, I saw the new Spider-Man movie. And like everybody else says, it's really freaking good. Please go see it like right now. It's really, really good. But I think there's something I wanted to talk about with the movie concerning a flaw I saw. And it's such an interesting flaw because it's a flaw that I don't think I would even change. And it's a flaw in the movie that honestly may not even matter in the long run. The first thing that I have to address though is the runtime of this movie. It's a very long animated film, I think legitimately over 2 hours, and if not actually 2 hours, it's right up there with the 2-hour mark. And the reason it's 2 hours is because it has to cover so much. It starts off with exemplifying Gwen Stacy's relationship with her father and how she became kind of the outcast of her own world. It dives into Miles and his relationship with his parents, how it's changed, his relationship with just himself as a person, his relationship with Gwen. It goes into Spot, goes across Miles being with the other Spider-Man, his duty to himself, his duty to the universe. It touches on a lot of subjects in a way that I think a lot of animated films steer away from, because it takes itself, I think, very maturely. But because of that long run time and because of how much goes into it, there is an initial fear, and I would say a criticism on my end, about pacing. And there's two separate ways that I want to address this pacing issue. Because the first 45 minutes of the film, just objectively, from like a narrative constructive standpoint, from me critiquing it as a script editor, the first 45 minutes really don't need to be there. At least not all of it. And what I mean by that is that for the first 45 minutes, the movie really isn't about anything. I'm saying the actual core of the movie, the central conflict, only happens when Peter learns about the canon events and his responsibilities to and around it, considering the other Spider-Man. And that only happens when Gwen actually learns about Spot during that hologram section. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. But prior to that, it's all lead up and build up, without any actual inciting incident. And that's pretty crazy, because again, the film is 2 hours long, and for 45 minutes of it, we're not actually engaging with the real conflict. And that usually would be a flaw. But here's why I don't think it is. First of all, it's just so pretty. And honestly, I think that's just like the craziest part about the movie. There's something about animation and how it's represented that as a visual medium has a different effect on a consumer than written work. I think the same thing can apply to video games. I don't think as much, because video games are a bit more limited, I think, in kind of like the wild things they can produce visually, simply because of like, you know, a graphics engine. But animation, and especially this movie, is just dazzling when it's on point. And even though nothing about the Vulture sequence or Miles's schooling or a bunch of other things like the cake sequence, even though none of that ultimately had an effect on the plot, really, again, the first 45 minutes didn't really have an effect on the plot. And again, I think this is like a controversial topic, so if you guys don't agree with me on that, that's perfectly fine. I would be willing to concede. But from my perspective, the first 45 minutes didn't have a true effect on the plot. It was way more build-up, and I don't think you need 45 minutes of build-up, but even still, it was so beautiful that I didn't care. I was along for the ride. I simply liked watching those things happen. And I think that is the beauty of animation, right? For example, I'll say this. If I was given a script, the same script of this movie, and I was hired on to edit it, and I read through 45 pages of no inciting incidents, I would rip it to shreds. I would tell my client, hey, I really like what you're going for here, but I would highly advise around keeping this kind of conflict, this central core narrative, from your audience for this long. I think I would be justified. But that's because I'm reading it on a piece of paper. It is a true testament, I think, to the ability of the animators and all the people who do the visual work and the, you know, auditory work, the Foley artists, everything that goes into actually creating the movie, that they were able to make such an insanely beautiful movie. It was because of that that ultimately it's a core aspect of the film. It is so much more than just a story. I truly believe this Spider-Man movie exists just as art, even separate from the really interesting narrative that it tells. And if I were to look at it, I would never say, cut those 45 minutes out, seeing what it is. I can understand that. I am not too deep into editing and narrative structure, and I don't think myself so posh, knowledgeable in this subject that I can't say, no, this was just too pretty to get rid of. It's almost like the rule of cool, but for visualizations. So it's from that respect that I think that even though, sure, is it a flaw? Does it go on too long? Yeah, maybe. But I enjoyed it so much, and I think so many other people did, that it borderline doesn't matter. And it's borderline a strength. And I think that leads into the second aspect of why it really shouldn't even be fixed in the first place. I think Across the Spiderverse, for me, is completely dependent upon how the sequel works out. And I didn't know there was going to be a sequel. I legitimately went into this movie thinking it was going to be a standalone, like, second entry for Into the Spider-Verse. I had no idea that there was going to be another movie set up. And because of that, the pacing was so bizarre to me. Because if you think about it, if you're thinking that this movie is going to be self-contained, and you're 2 hours in and they're still introducing new characters, you're wondering how they're possibly going to wrap it up. You're wondering where these kind of like plot lines are going to come to fruition. You're going to wonder where the threads are going. And then the movie just ends. It was a huge surprise to me. And one that makes sense for how they paced this film. Because they did not need to rush anything. I think this film and the next one that they're going to make could honestly go down as some of the most ambitious and interesting animated movies of like this century. Because this movie's pacing is completely dependent on how the next movie pays off. Because we are still in the midst of so much conflict, of so much characterization. We have our new Miles, we have our different world, we have our alternate reality, we have Miguel and all the other Peters who are dependent on trying to fix these canon events just to stay alive. I really don't think anyone's in the wrong here, and I think all the setup was actually necessary, or at least potentially necessary, to be able to tell a story this complex and multifaceted. And that's, I think, the craziest part about writing is that there is this rule. You should always make your stories to be good enough to act as standalones. Never write a story, never create anything narrative-wise that is dependent on its successors to be validated. I don't think that's what this movie did. I think this movie ultimately was still good enough to be on its own, but will be strengthened by the sequel in the future. I think there is so much still left on the line to explore. And with that being said, I will just indulge a little bit in talking about Spot, because I think on a conceptual level, he's just so freaking awesome. Like, I know we've been getting a lot of really cool animated villains, but Spot is one of my favorite, and it's because of the, I think, narrative elements and the tones and the theme behind him. Because as we see in the beginning, he isn't a bad guy. He doesn't even want to, like, rob the convenience store that he's at. What he does is out of necessity. He doesn't have a job, he doesn't have a family, he has nothing. And I think everything that he's doing as the villain comes back to his particular situation, and it's an exaggeration and an allegory for it. He lost literally everything. He has nothing. He has no identity. He has no faith. He has no family. He's literally, and this becomes a part of his character, he's a blank slate. And the only part of his identity that he can latch onto is Spider-Man. It's so cool to have this idea of an arch enemy be an arch enemy, not because of some like master plan or some huge want. It's because that's what he sees himself as. It's that he's nothing more. Of course, I think there's going to be some type of movement in the second film to maybe rectify that, to have him gain some sort of identity, but it's just super cool that he is formless. He is just the villain, and he recognizes that his whole life now is centered around being Spider-Man's enemy, and that's why he's doing what he's doing. And that's just really cool. I think that's an interesting take on a villain. But ultimately, I think the real big bad of this series is gonna be Miguel. I think that there are aspects of his character that have signaled he is going to be far more in opposition to Miles than Spot will. I could be wrong, And I also think Miguel could also still be redeemed, but he's being set up as kind of this antagonistic figure, this symbol of authority, utilitarian kind of sense that will sacrifice the nuanced aspects of a person, the needs of the individuals to save the many. And there's plenty of superhero stories and just regular stories that I think have commentary on people who are Machiavellian like that. But this is all to say, without rambling, even though the pacing was super weird in the movie, they knew it was weird and made this film so gorgeous that it didn't even matter. I was gobsmacked watching some of these fight scenes, the animation, even for Hobie, who just constantly changed all the different set pieces and scenes that they had. It was just really cool. And if you haven't seen it, see it, please. And like I said, there are no perfect stories. Every story can be improved, always. But for this story in particular, even though there are flaws, I might not change them. So I just wanted to speak on that a little bit. I thought it was very interesting. If you guys have anything that you want me to talk about, let me know. I'll get to it. If you want to check out my books or my website for editing services, check out my Patreon. I'll put the link in the description and my website as well. As always, it was a pleasure. I will talk to you all again soon.